Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Let's get started. It's just a minute after 1 o'clock. We're very happy you were able to join us today. Today we have Dr. John Tropman with us, who is going to be presenting Building Effective Decisions, which is a follow-up webinar from our May 13th webinar that we've done, Producing Efficient Meetings. So if you didn't have a chance to see our May 13th webinar live, in many of the announcements we sent, there was a recording attached to that as well. So I would encourage you to check it out. Just before we get started on our presentation, just a few things about the network. As of July 1st of last year, you can join for free. So if you're not a member of the network, we encourage you to join. There's lots of great benefits for joining, networking opportunities. We're building a mentorship program. There's lots of regional events going on, as well as a big annual conference that we've just hosted in Boston this past June. Of course, this webinar series is another great benefit as well. So without any further delay, I want to introduce again Dr. John Tropman for our presentation today, Building Effective Decisions. John?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm talking to you from the University of Michigan. And as Kristen said, this is a follow-up webinar to the Efficient Meetings one, so do take a look at that. One of the slides in today's presentation gives a quick summary of that, which I'll sort of go through just to, A, refresh those who had joined us last time, and B, to let those who didn't have that opportunity sort of, well, know what we talked about. So basically, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to talk about with me, there's my phone number, there's my email, and I'm happy to get feedback from you. We can do some of that today, but I've gotten emails subsequently as well. The whole package, I guess, is available in this book put out by Sage Publications. So take a look at that. So last time, I shared some good practices from the Meeting Masters Research Project. These are people, probably numbering about 400 now, who run terrific meetings. I observed them, my graduate students observed them, we videotaped them, and we were able to distill some key principles that they used to really do a terrific job of running meetings. The first thing was they didn't have any more reports in their meetings. Many meetings are newsletter meetings, going around one after the other with here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm doing. They got rid of that, and they broke out that content and reorganized it for the agenda into three big sort of pots, well, actually one small pot and two big pots. The small pot was a few announcements at the beginning, followed by action and decision items, and the third big piece was brainstorming items. Generally speaking, the announcements were only about 10% of the meeting space. All the rest were put online. Action items were about 60% of the meeting, and brainstorming, which involves items for the future, was about 30% of the meeting, and they did that every time. In the rule of halves, the person who organized the meeting actually got agenda items from people ahead of time. So the agenda was built in advance. Then it was sent out at the 3/4 point. So if you have a monthly meeting, such as a board, for example, you might send the agenda and related materials out in the third week. If you meet on Friday, you'd send it out Thursday. So you sort of get the point. The 1/6 piece is just the minimum number of future items. It's closer to a third than a sixth. The rule of 2/3 simply says that in most meetings, At about the 2/3 point, people's interest begins to fade and they begin to think of downstream items for their own day. That's why brainstorming is at the end, because it helps bring people back in a collective and collegial way. The agenda bell, which you can see in the previous presentation, is simply a graph of a meeting that's energy over time. The meeting starts with a bit of low energy, the highest energy is in the middle, and then it begins to decline toward the end. What that means is that the most important item for that meeting should be put pretty much between the 40% point and the 60% point, or right in the middle. The agenda is basically prepared like a restaurant menu, with each item sort of the equivalent to a dish, and there is on the right-hand side a running clock. Just keep in mind that an agenda without times is like a restaurant menu with no prices. For minutes, don't do he said, she said minutes. Simply use a passive voice and say something like, the van purchase agreement was discussed, some were in favor, others were opposed, it was decided, and that way we're focusing not on who said what, but what was said. And finally, the options memo technique is to be used when you're presenting something that you've worked on outside the meeting to a group. You simply say, we looked at the problem of X, there were 4 options that we considered. That's the important point. Definitely say what the options were. Of those available options, we picked number 3 because, and here is our preliminary recommendation. That'll make things go much more smoothly. And finally, if you have to send stuff out ahead of time, don't send big fat reports. Less is more. What you need to send out is an executive summary. People can go to the website and find the fuller document. So that sort of brings us up to date. We're now going to go into the meeting itself. And this is where you have to really work in real time. A lot of the meeting preparation you can do before the meeting, but now it's started, and our goal is high-quality decisions. I'm going to give you a little quiz. I'm not going to ask anybody how you did, but here's the quiz. How many 9s are in the array of numbers from 0 and 100? Just count the 9s and write it down somewhere. That's step number 1. Step number 2, check your work. Just be sure that you've got the right answer. Now, all of you who got 20 got the correct answer. I myself didn't get the correct answer when I did this. I got the most popular answer, which is 11. 10 and 19 are other popular answers. The way I got to 11 was I counted up 9, 19, and so on up to 99, and then I remembered that 99 had 2 9s in it, and I felt pretty pleased with myself. Of course, I was wrong. So when we work alone in decision making, we can make 3 big mistakes. 1, we get the wrong answer. That's called selective perception. I ask you to check your work, and I do this with a lot of groups I work with. Almost nobody gets the correct answer for checking. They do check their work, but if they get the same answer that they got before, which is what I got, I checked my work and I got 11 again, so I felt doubly good about it. That's called review for proof only. Most of us are not open to actually checking our own work. And then I became committed to my answer. I bet lunch with the guy who was showing it to me thinking, I'm going to get a free lunch, and it turned out he got a free lunch. Groups work better if they are run correctly. They correct errors, they provide social support, and they provide mild competition for respect, and each of those things is going to help us do a good job. On the other hand, vigilant decision-making is where we want to go, but there are problems on either side. One is defensive avoidance, where we simply don't make decisions, or the other is hyperactivity and panic. You can read a little bit more about this in Janice and Mann's book on decision making. And I've listed a bunch of problems here. Lack of time, because the meeting isn't run right, lack of hope that we can actually do it, we really don't have freedom of choice, we don't have the skills, or we don't have the people in the room whom we need to do the job, distraction. I was in a meeting recently where a person took a cell phone call, and normally they would leave, but in this particular case, the guy keeps on talking, and we're talking, and then he looks up at us and says, "Can you keep it down?" We were just completely flummoxed by that. Attribution errors, which are sort of passing the buck or blaming people, and a feeling of sort of disasterizing, that there's no reversibility to the decision, all of those erode the ability to make high-quality decisions. And there's been a lot written about high-quality decisions, and let's start with taking a look at rotten decisions. And there's a whole bunch of them. I've listed some here, and while I normally don't put footnotes in slides, because you might want to read a little bit more about these, I have given the source of the discussion of each of these problems at the bottom of this particular slide. So here they all are, and I'll tell you about each one of them just a little bit. Folly, developed by Barbara Tuchman, is a decision that she calls counterproductive in its own time. There were alternative courses of action available, and you picked the wrong one. So we want to avoid that. Groupthink, developed by Irving Janis, is that situation in which nobody wants to raise the elephant in the living room issue. Sometimes it's because the group is so cohesive that nobody wants to say anything. Sometimes it's because the boss is so powerful that you don't want to say anything to the boss. And so we all sort of agree up front, but we don't really agree inside. The Abilene Paradox was developed by Jerry Harvey. It's a training film that you can actually see. It's basically the situation where everybody does something that nobody wants to do. So it's sort of like groupthink. In the little movie, 4 people are sitting around on a porch in Abilene. You can see the thermometer behind them. They're playing cards, and it says 110 degrees, so you know it's hot. The father says, "Maybe we should go into Abilene and have lunch. What do you think, Mother?" Mother says, "If you want to, dear," so she punts. The son says, "Have we fixed the air conditioning in the car yet, Dad?" Now that was meant to be a deal breaker because we know the temperature, but Dad didn't pick up on it, nor did anybody else, and so he says no, and the next scene is them driving down a dusty road, all the windows open, heading toward Abilene. They have a terrible lunch, and on the way back, the father says, "Well, that was a dumb idea. Why did we do that?" And Mother says, "Well, you wanted to." And he said, "Well, I didn't mean we should do it. I was just suggesting it." So because of a lack of concretization, they all sort of drifted into an action that nobody really wanted to do. The garbage can model of decision-making was developed by Michael Cohen, the late Michael Cohen, a professor at the University of Michigan, and a couple of colleagues. And basically, it says this: to make high-quality decisions, you need to have 4 types of people in the room: problem knowers, problem solvers, resource controllers, and decision makers looking for work, which is their term. So the problem knowers are those people who really understand the problem that we're trying to address. Problem solvers are creative people who always have good ideas, but often don't know the particular problem, but if they're there, they can help you out. Resource controllers are often middle managers who sign off on money and people. two resources that you're going to need if you're going to make a decision implementable, and so they need to be there. And then the decision maker is looking for work are those people, perhaps a senior manager, who can sort of give blessing to the decision going forward. The title comes from the fact that Cohen and his colleagues argue that most of these folks are assembled at random, about 2 at a time. So you have to have 3 or 4 meetings. First meeting you have, let's say, problem knowers and resource controllers. Then the second meeting you might have a couple more, but you don't have problem knowers. And so you might need several meetings actually to get something done. And that's rework, and it takes a lot of time. The boiled frog is a pretty popular metaphor these days, and you may have actually heard about it or even done an experiment like it. If you put a frog in cold water and slowly heat the water, the frog doesn't notice that it's getting hotter and boils to death. The business application of that somewhat grisly metaphor is the just noticeable difference syndrome. The change in your organization needs to be slightly faster than the change in your environment, or you may actually wind up being a boiled frog. Defensive routines was developed by Chris Argyris at Harvard University. Defensive routines occur where there is some item that is not discussable in the organization. And he adds that the non-discussability of it isn't discussable either. So you really don't think about it. Groupthink is a situation where a group goes on and on and on. They're clearly not making progress. They need to take a break. They need to bracket the item and return to it, and they don't do it. So they keep on with a very unproductive line of discussion, wearing everyone out. Zeno's paradox, you probably remember from your high school algebra class. So Zeno said that if you go halfway to the wall, then you go halfway again and half again, you'll get infinitely close to the wall, but you will not actually reach the wall. Decision making is something like that. We get really close, but sometimes we can't quite punch through. And the final one, Occam's razor, is a term that has come from the Bishop of Occam, who was asked to come up with a rule to decide among competing mathematical proofs. His rule was the proof with the fewest steps is the one that is the most elegant and should be the one that we use. And decision making needs to follow Occam's razor as well. We need to have really simple steps. Simpler is better, and it has to actually, though, address the problem, or it would be thought of as simplistic. Okay, so this gives us a bunch of problems that we have, and we're going to try to avoid those. So how can we do that? Well, the first thing we can do is that we can have a framework for approaching decision-making item by item in our meeting. John Cleese, the actor in an old film, Meetings, Bloody Meetings, gives us these steps. You start with the problem, then you discuss the evidence, then you argue about what the evidence proves, then you decide, and then you move toward implementation steps. So rather than saying, here's the problem, what does anyone think? You can start by saying, let's discuss the problem, be sure we all agree on the problem. Then what is the evidence we're bringing to bear on this problem? How So managing the steps in the discussion, having a template in your own mind about what to do is really helpful. Janice and Mann, again, talk about need, which is the same as problems. Alternatives, which is sort of like evidence, gains, losses to self and others, pros and cons. And then commit to act, and then implement. So you can use either one of these or some combination of them that makes sense to you. But having the decision-making discussion proceed through steps is going to be a big help. Now, the people I interviewed, the meeting masters, had a subset of them, because all people who ran efficient meetings didn't actually make high-quality decisions. So let me just take a minute to say what a high-quality decision is. And we can use a sort of grading scheme and a portfolio example to set this up. An A decision is one in which all stakeholders win, though they don't all have to win equally. So if your investment portfolio is full of stocks that all went up, that's probably a good day in the market. However, they may not have all gone up equally. A B decision is one in which some stocks went up, some stocks went down, some stakeholders gained, some stakeholders did not, but on balance, it's a very positive outcome. A C decision is one in which some stakeholders won, some stakeholders lost. We might shift around who were the winners and losers, but we haven't really progressed beyond the point at which we were before. And in a portfolio example, that would be a case where some of the stocks went up, some of the stocks went down, but your net worth is still the same as it was at the beginning of the day. A D decision is the opposite of the B. Some winners, more losers, and you're actually behind, though the people who won don't feel that way. However, overall, when you look at it, you've lost ground. This would be, in the stock case, some of your stocks went up, others went down, but your net worth is less than it was when you started. And finally, we have the F, or nuclear war decision, where everybody loses. So we're going to try to have an A, or certainly a B plus decision, and it invites us to think of decisions as an actual product. So since a decision can be thought of as a group product, then we can ask, how good was it? So how did the people who were decision masters, people who were able to help groups over and over again, come to very excellent decisions? What did they do that we can learn from? And it took my team a long time to figure this out because, well, for one thing, it was in real time. And secondly, the process is subtle and required us to develop some new conceptualizations. So that's what I'm going to share with you. And the new conceptualizations are listed below: decision rules, decision mosaic, decision elements, rounds of discussion, decision crystallization, and decision sculpting. Now, these are probably all terms that you've never heard of before, so we'll have to take a look at them with some care. Decision rules are norms that make decisions okay. And there are 7 of them that we use on a regular basis, and we bring them into decision-making settings really from our wider world. The extensive decision rule is essentially the breadth of preference. One person, one vote is an example of it, and it's one of our most popular rules. How many people want to go to McDonald's? Hands up, the ayes have it. And somehow that's always thought of as fair. However, keep this in mind. The application of any single decision rule advantages some and disadvantages others. There are no neutral decision rules. So in the case of the extensive decision rule, minorities of one sort or another are going to be disadvantaged. Vegetarians will typically never call for a vote. because there are probably never enough vegetarians to win a vote. So they will depend on rule number 2, the intensive decision rule. And as groups come to decisions, they're interested in how do people broadly feel. They're interested in number 2, who feels strongly, how strongly do they feel, and can we accommodate them? So in a menu-making decision, we can generally add vegetarian and vegan alternatives, gluten-free alternatives without harming our overall menu, and that addresses people who feel strongly or who have special needs. But we're also interested in, like, the cooks or involvement. Who has to carry out the decision, and what do they think? So if, say, in my world, we're talking about a new class, then the question is, well, who is actually going to teach this class, and what do they think about it? If you're in a medical setting and doctors are making decisions, you'll definitely want to know what the nurses think. So the people who are involved need to be involved in having their views as part of the decision process. The fourth rule is experts. What do the lawyers think? What do the scientists think? What does Zagat say about the restaurant? Let's at least touch base with any relevant expertise. There may not be any in some particular cases, but often there are people who know a lot, and we should ask them. The power rule is, what does the boss think? Those would be the decision makers looking for work. So we definitely need to get the boss's view or the C-level team's view on what's going on and what they will accept so that we can at least work within appropriate parameters. Sixthly, stakeholders not in the room. Not everybody is going to be in the room. So therefore, we need to think a little bit about people who might be impacted or implicated in the decision that do not have a voice at our immediate table. Perhaps we need to explore that voice or give voice to it, but it's worth thinking about. And finally, the imperatives of the decision itself. This is where Occam's razor comes in. Is it easy to do? Is it hard to do? Is it low-hanging fruit? Will it be complicated? So we're going to try to make it easy and simple and fun even to do, and we're going to try to make the decision work in that direction. So those are the decision rules. Now, a couple of things about them. As you look at them, think of your organization and put 100% at the bottom of that list, and then weight your own organization. Some organizations will be always using the extensive rule, so that might be 90%. Others really don't vote at all. Quaker meetings very heavily preference number 2. So they don't vote, they just process until people have sort of come to an agreement. In hospital settings, science and expertise counts for a lot. So what we're going to try to come up with is our decision culture. And when we get to the decision crystallization step, knowing which among these decision rules is most preferred in our particular organization will help you advance suggestions that have a pretty good chance of successful acceptance. The decision mosaic. Decisions are really, the way we say it, a decision. It sounds like it's a single thing, but really it's made up of parts. Decision is much more well thought of as a collective noun. So it's a mosaic of elements. And so decision building or decision assembling is a better way to think about decisions. Think of it as a menu. And so, as we often do in the Tropman household, the question comes up, what shall we have for dinner tonight? And that question has a lot of parts. It has what time might we eat, what food might we eat, would we go in or out, are the grandkids coming over, do we have any kind of leftovers that we want to use? So all those things need to be thought of, and those are all elements in the decision process. So think of yourself as unpacking the decision into its elements and then proceeding element by element. Now, to do this, we would use the Gutman scale. And I've drawn a little triangle here, and I want to explain the Gutman scale. So once you identify the relevant elements, let's say B through C or B through J, then the Gutman scale is an array in which B influences C through J, A influences B through J, not that A particularly, but just so you have a whole bunch of elements, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and the first element influences all the other elements. The second element influences the third element and all subsequent elements, and so on. So what you want to try to do is start with the dominant element. The elements are arranged in a dominance hierarchy. So if we go back to the question, what should we have for dinner tonight, you can think about what would be the dominant element. And there may actually be a couple that are good contenders, and you'd have to pick one of them. But a lot of people begin in the fridge. And I always say, well, that's probably a B because it's ruled out a prior decision, in or out. So in or out would be like one of the widest decisions that you could make. If it's out, then you're going to look up restaurants and times and so on. If it's in, then you're going to look in the fridge and in the pantry and so on and so forth. So we try to array the elements like a decision tree on its side. And you want to try to avoid, if you can, starting in the middle, because if you start in the middle and get to the end, then you go back to the dominant element, then you realize you have to redo everything, and you really want to not have to do that. Rounds of discussion. So a round of discussion is that point at which each person has made one contribution, or each person who wants to make a contribution has made it. At that point, there's going to be like a little pause, and that's when you actually have to go to work. As the meeting chairperson, you're really not participating too much in the sense of offering opinions. You're listening because what you're really doing is conceptualizing where are the agreements, where are the disagreements. And so with that in mind, you have to think to yourself, are we ready to go here? I notice Sid hasn't said anything, so maybe I'll say we're about ready to sort of take stock of where we are, folks. But Sid, I notice you haven't said anything at this point. Is there anything you want to add to the discussion? Or you may not do that. So that's going to be the first sort of judgment call. Are we ready to approach a crystallization moment? Now, decision crystallization is where you have to really step up to the plate, and it involves 4 steps. Everybody who wants to has made a contribution, and so the first thing that you do is you say, well, let's see where we are. Here's what I'm hearing. some people want to go to this place, some people want to go to that place, some people have brought their lunch, but are willing to go out to lunch if everybody else is going out to lunch, and they'll eat theirs tomorrow. So your groups, because they're participating, are not really listening to the overall sort of developing point of view. So therefore, you need to summarize that for them. The next step is a conceptual step. That's where you make a suggestion for action. It's called vocalization. So you might say, well, there seems to be a general preference for going out and a willingness of those for whom it isn't exactly a preference. So maybe we could try the Chinese restaurant down the street. And so that's step two, suggest something to do. But you have to give reasons why people would do that, and that's why we're going to go back to our decision rules. And we sort of reference them in the use of ordinary language. So we might say, I suggested the Chinese restaurant because that seems to satisfy most of what people want. They have very good vegan and vegetarian options. It doesn't really involve a lot of trouble getting there. It's got very good ratings from local restaurant guides. The boss doesn't care, so that's the power one. I've touched on the expert one. And maybe 6 and 7 don't apply. So you actually explain why the decision is a good one by going back to and anchoring it in the decision rules that we have already talked about. And that's usually the psychological point at which the decision is made. And people will speak affirmatively, sounds good, I'm okay with it, things like that. So then you need to move on by saying, well, with that in mind, let's go to the next item on our agenda and see if we can make some headway on that. So you redirect them to the next decision element or menu item or agenda item and help them move on. And then there's, of course, one final thing, which is decision sculpting. And decision sculpting is standing back and taking a look at the overall decision and seeing whether anything has been left out. Now, the reason I have a pig there is because I'm going to give you a food example of decision sculpting. So we're building a menu, and we want to see if it has any problems in it. And one of my favorite dinners that my grandmother used to make was pork dinner. Pork dinner, as some of you may know, consists of roast pork, mashed potatoes, sauerkraut, mashed turnips, applesauce, all covered with a succulent pork gravy. And you would say, oh my gosh, my wife is Italian in background, and she thinks that that's lacking in presentation. She once told me that she wasn't sure whether it had been eaten yet or not. That was a really hurtful comment. However, I will say this in terms of stakeholders not in the room. It's a white dinner. There's very little color in that dinner. And so you might, in a sense, want to say, do we have a sort of monochromatic decision here where we've left out some key elements, some people, some perspectives that really need to be there? So stepping back, taking a look at the whole thing is a good way to sort of wrap things up for a decision-making element. Now let me just sort of tell you that there's some steps that you're going to go through. Number one, for most of us, we're going to be unconsciously incompetent in decision making. So that's sort of, we really don't know a lot about decision making, though we do it, but we don't know that we don't know about it, so we're sort of blissfully ignorant. The second stage is consciously incompetent. So after today's presentation, you might be sort of at that stage. So I'm not going to ask you to do anything with this right away. I'm going to ask you to use it as a lens to look through at the decision-making episodes that you're sitting in and see, you can hear decision crystallization. That didn't happen. We passed over that. We didn't do any agreement on decision rules. So we don't know how to apply them in this case. We don't know what our decision culture was. This will help you get to stage 3, which is sort of consciously competent. Okay, so you know what you're doing, and you're still thinking about it, and then you will hopefully get to stage 4, unconsciously competent, which is the decision masters that I interviewed, who were just really good at it, and they didn't have to think a lot about it. So start by observing, then do a little practice, and it's going to take you several months to get reasonably comfortable with this sort of system that I'm talking about, but it is self-reinforcing. The better you get, the better you'll be. The better you are, the better you'll be. So it will move along quite smoothly. Here's what I was talking about before on the decision audit. So you can sort of revisit that, the all-win decision, the sum win, the null set, the opposite of the B helps us out. Now, when we think of decision making, we might want to think about doing a decision autopsy. And a decision autopsy asks what went right and what went wrong with respect to the decision. Now remember that little formula there, results, which is the R, equals D, decision, plus implementation. So there are 2 parts. And you can have a great decision, but it can be implemented in a flawed way. You can have a rotten decision that can be creatively implemented. But where you really want to sort of soar is to get a great decision that's smoothly implemented. And you can do that by looking at some of the decisions that you made overall. And so on the old way, good decision, bad decision. The new way, things gone right, few or many. Things gone wrong, few or many. So it helps us to sort of broaden our analysis of the decision piece. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do now is take a second, write down a couple things. You're not going to have to share them, but just so that you won't forget them. Writing things down is God's way of showing how sloppy our thinking often is. And then, after that, write down a couple things that you're going to try. And I hope one of them is observe carefully, and then after that, try occasionally, then analyze. And this is Edward Deming's very famous plan, do, check, act cycle. So we're now in the planning phase, then you're going to be in the doing phase, then you're going to check, then you're going to act again, replan, and so on. Okay, so that wraps up the presentation part of what I'm going to do. I'm going to invite our host to become involved, although she's always been involved. You just haven't seen her.
Hi, John. I'm here. My webcam is booting up.
Is.
I'm here.
Pops
So that
right
was
up.
really great. So now we're going to open the floor to question and answers. So if you see the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen in the box where you see the video of John and I, go ahead and start typing in your questions, and I will read them aloud as the host. So feel free to share. I'm curious, John, I'm wondering if you can share a story of your own in a situation where you had, difficult meeting scenario and decision-making scenario, and kind of what you did to solve that problem.
Well,
didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I just have a feeling you have a lot of expertise in this area.
It took me quite a while to develop the part I just shared, because nobody talks about decision rules and decision crystallization and so on. So when I was interim dean at the School of Social Work, I used that in faculty meetings. And so there'd be discussion, and I didn't really say a lot. I sometimes ask a question. And then we would come to that point where, well, there are 50 people. So we talked about this new course, so I might say, well, I think we might be ready to vote on this. So I'm sort of using and invoking the extensive decision rule. And then I would say most people seem to be positive as a step that we might take, and I think it addresses a need, students are for it. So I try to touch on various reasons why we should act positively, and frequently I was pretty successful at that. Sometimes I would go in the other direction and say, well, there seem to be a lot of differing opinions on this, so we're probably not ready to take the step of approving it. What we might want to do is identify some key principles, and maybe the committee that brought it forward could take a fresh look. So in that case, I'm sort of bracketing it, but people are happy with that because that's a kind of decision. It's just not, we're just not approving it, but the decision is we're going to look at it again and bring it back. So those are just two examples of different ways that you might approach sort of trying to take leadership in keeping the group moving forward, which is what you want to do, and doing so in a respectful and involving way.
Great. I have a couple of questions that have come in, so I'm going to read the first question. The question is, how important does culture play in group decision-making, especially if you are in charge of the group process?
Well, culture really does play an important part. And in, for example, human service culture, we tend to emphasize process a little bit more. I'm not sure whether that's the kind of culture that the questioner was talking about, but so we'll tend to discuss more, and so it's a challenge to try to sort of articulate with that culture. I myself get in a bit of hot water there because I tend to be a more rapid decision maker, and I find myself at odds with some of my colleagues. Sometimes I want to move faster. I have to watch that. As between, let's say, large cultures, like American culture tends to be more quick in its decision making as opposed to Japanese culture. So Japanese culture, as I observed when I had a Fulbright in Japan, they tend to spend a much longer time discussing at the front end and have worked out a lot more details in the decision making than we typically do. So their implementation is much easier. And at least in the automobile industry, using their famous phrase, art to part, they would tend to get from concept to customer more quickly using that method because they had come to more agreements before. So that might be something that we could learn. If the questioner meant various kinds of ethnic cultures and how things are, the book on called Riding the Waves of Culture, where the author, a guy named Tropman, talks about European decision-making with the more volatile Mediterranean cultures clashing with the more staid Nordic cultures, and trying to get all those people on the same page is also a challenge. So you have to, like any recipe, you have to sort of configure it to address the cultures, and I'm putting an S on it, that are in the room.
Thank you. I have another question here, and I also have someone making a request to show your slide where you're featuring the book. And the question is, one person dominating the process can be tricky. How do you give equal voice to the rest? A very good question.
Could you say that? Could you say that one more time?
Sure. One person dominating the process can be tricky. How do you give equal voice to the rest? And I think what they mean is to the rest of the group.
Okay. So one of the reasons, that's sort of controlling the over-participator is another way to think about that, or at least one of the ways I hear it. And one of the reasons that you put times, and when I say times, I mean a running clock. It's not like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, but be running right alongside the agenda items are 2 to 2:15, 2:15 to 2:20, and so on and so forth, so that you have a neutral way of sort of even interrupting that person and saying something like, Jim, we only have about 10 more minutes on this item, and I want to be sure that we can get around the room. So that's one way. A second way, if you know those people and you know that Jim participates early and often, you might start off the presentation by saying, well, I'd like everybody to go around and just share what they think about this important proposal, and I'm going to start with, and then you pick the person next to Jim and go in the opposite direction, so Jim is the last person to participate. So in that way, you sort of kick it off, and you just sort of go around. It's people who don't have an observing ego about their own participation often over-participate. When you have over-participation, you have under-participation, because others just really don't want to deal with Jim. And that pushes the decision-making into the parking lot or the hallway, which isn't good. So it's a tough one. And the third way is, and I have had to do this on occasion, is to speak to somebody or with somebody before the meeting or after and say, you know, you really participate a lot and it's really great, but I've sort of noticed that you participate a lot more than others, and so this upcoming meeting, I'd like you to help me try to get everybody involved. So you try to make an ally of them in terms of the participatory process. And none of these are perfect. It's just some ways that you can try to do that. Is this a slide?
Yes, they had, I believe so, yes,
okay.
to take a look at the book. I have another question.
Okay.
The question is regarding the garbage can decision problem.
Okay.
You state that there are 4 types of people in the decision-making process. How does this theory act out in smaller companies and nonprofits that may only have 2 to 3 acting decision makers?
Well, with great delicacy, I would say, possibly. Sometimes you need to augment the decision-making group with others. That's one of the reasons that you have the rule of halves, because as you're putting the agenda together, you say, well, here's an issue, and we really need a lawyer. We don't happen to have a lawyer, but there is a lawyer on the board. So maybe for this situation, we'll bring in that expertise. So sometimes you augment the group, or you get information from that person to bring in. Sometimes you might just not have a creative problem solver, so you might want to, but you know a few of them, so you might talk to them ahead of time and then come in with some ideas from that person as if that person were there. So you can sometimes, it's called remote participation. So you say, well, I wasn't sure that we maybe had as many ideas. So I did ask a few people who dealt with this problem before in other agencies, and I put on the sheet some of the things that they ran into and that they were thinking about, you know, for our own process as we think about doing this. So you can sometimes augment the problem knower and the problem solver one. Often the people that you have are the resource controller and maybe the agency, you know, CEO. So it might be, so they are more likely to be there than necessarily the other two.
Great. I have quite a few questions that have come in, so I'm just going to move ahead.
Okay.
Our next question is, at our board meetings, some members will make a motion to spend money and the item isn't on the agenda. If the argument is persuasive, the board usually approves it. How can we avoid this?
Well, that's a problem. So the chairperson, if that's become a piece of board culture, then the sort of consultative problem that I see is moving the board to agree that we're not going to deal with stuff that's not on the agenda. However, that said, a lot of boards have formulaic agendas. That is, old business, new business, disgustingly old business, stuff like that. So if you follow in the development of the board agenda the rule of halves, then that person should be able to say, I would like to have this item on the agenda, and put it there. The problem with introducing stuff like that on the fly is that people don't really have a chance to think about it. The reason you send stuff out at the 3/4 point is so that people can actually think about stuff. Let me say a little bit more about that. One of the things that we said last time that's pretty controversial is my recommendation not to hand stuff out at meetings. Send it out online. People want to print it, they can. But if you bring along stuff, then people won't think about it until they get there. So what we're going to try to do is have a deal. We'll send it out early. We're going to deal with the items on the agenda. We're not going to really deal with items not on the agenda, but that's going to take a little while to get there. Stuff that comes up like that surprises people, and you don't really want to be in that situation. And that really is the chairperson's job, that is the chairperson of the agency's job, to say, well, look, I'm just going to have to rule that we'll take this up at the next meeting. But I wouldn't do that right at that moment. I would try to send something out ahead of time and so on, so that the board begins to understand that we have to have an agenda-driven meeting so that people can have a chance to think through the issues in a thoughtful way. The person who's proposing it probably has. Other people probably haven't. Okay.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question is, what strategies would be effective to get the decision maker, the boss, to move in the direction that you feel would be helpful? Also, what do you feel is the best timing to include them? Kind of a two-part question. I can repeat it if you like.
Yes, let me listen to that carefully.
So what strategies would be effective to get the decision makers, the boss, to move in the direction that you feel would be helpful? And then the second part is also, what do you feel is the best timing to include them?
Okay, so I think I understand that question. We call that leading from a second position. So I'm taking it to mean that the person asking the question isn't the boss and wants to get the boss thinking in a certain way or moving in a certain way. So this involves, in a sense, softening up the boss, and it would depend a lot on the individual in question, but it takes sort of a non-threatening exposure, for one thing. So you're going to have to meet with the boss several times, begin to talk about what other people are doing, and why this would be good for us. You're going to have to address the issue of cost, and one of the ways to address the issue of cost is to propose something I found really particularly effective, a pilot program. The idea of a pilot program tends to be appealing to bosses because it doesn't involve necessarily long-standing commitment to any money. And when you want people to move in a different direction than the one they're moving in now, that's often innovation or change. Most agencies don't budget for that, so you're always faced with, well, it sounds good, but we don't have any money. So if you can think of some ways to maybe put together even just a small amount of resource, that would be very helpful. Or doing it in a small way to explore it, that would be good. So I would involve the boss early and non-fatefully in a sort of discussion type of situation. The longer you wait, the more it's going to be firm in your mind and not at all in the boss's mind, and that creates a space. So managing up involves sort of processes of exposure, preparation, soft selling, clearing. Clearing means, could we try this, could we try that? And Rosabeth Cantor has talked a lot about that in several of her books. So I would also suggest some reading of her work.
Thank you. We have another question. The question is, though I'm in meetings where it appears as though there is a small decision to make, but during the discussion, the evidence shows that there is a much more complex or long-range decision, what suggestions would you have in leading a discussion in that case?
Okay. I'm going to switch my phone here because I think I'm running out of power. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Is this here? Can you hear me now?
I can.
Yeah, I can't hear you though.
Can you hear me now? John? John, I can't hear you. We can't hear you. John, we can't hear you.
To a
There you go.
situation where we will agree in principle to move in a certain direction, but obviously the details are going to require a lot more discussion, and we will take them up in the other meetings. So you can start at the top and work down, or you can go the other way and say, well, there are a few small things that we're going to need to decide anyway. This is a much bigger issue, but immediately facing us are these. So let's act on these 2 or 3 small ones, and then we can revisit the larger issue at the next meeting. So either start from the top and work down, or you start from the bottom and work up.
Great. I have another question. Am I moving ahead too fast, or should we go on to the next question?
Kristen, for some reason I've lost my audio, so we may be at a point where we have to.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Stop, but if you will send me any other questions, I'll be happy to respond to the person who asked them by email.
Okay. Can you hear me? Hello? John?
I'm here. I'm back.
Okay. All right, great. Okay, we have another question
about that.
still. No,
okay,
that's okay.
So we can continue a little bit.
All right, we have another question.
Okay.
How does one manage the line between over-participating and pushing for active progress? I feel like you kind of touched on this a little bit.
Well,
but some tips would probably be helpful.
Yeah, that's really a judgment call, and I guess I'm going to use an old social work phrase, partialize the problem, because if you over-participate, there's going to be a point. Here's the scenario that happens. People get committed to something, they over-participate a little bit, and generally speaking, groups apply a discount rate to you depending on their judgment of the percent of over-participation that you're doing. So this causes a sort of negative cycle. So you sense that they're not with you, you sort of increase your participation, they increase their distancing from you, so you're going to reach a point of less and less. So my sort of suggestion is to spread your goals over several meetings and try to get small wins at several meetings rather than a big win at any meeting, because you're almost very likely to get into a situation where people are distancing themselves, just like the kid in first grade who used to raise both of his hands every time the teacher asked a question. And he was eager, but nobody else liked him. So that's, I think, what we have to keep in mind.
Okay. That was the last question. I'm just kind of browsing through the chat just to be sure we got everybody. Let's see. I think that was the last question. So I guess we'll begin to close it out. So John, thank you so much for presenting today.
I look
to the
hearing from you.
Yeah, sure. And to all the attendees, we'll be emailing the presentation slides and the recording out, the way to access that within the next day or so. So if you want to revisit this discussion or share it with anyone, you can feel free to do so. We'll be planning our next webinar sometime in July and then taking a break in August. So watch your email for the announcement of our next webinar. Thanks and have a great day.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.